Welcome to the bridge. Today, our special guest is Astrid R. Haas. She's an Austrian-Ugandan urban economist based in Hong Kong with over 15 years of experience working across research and practice. She is currently an adjunct professor at the School of Cities, University of Toronto, extraordinary lecturer at the African Tax Institute at the University of Pretoria. In addition, Astrid has worked extensively with city governments across Africa and Asia in diverse roles, including previously as an urban economist with the African Development Bank. She holds a master's degree in public financial management from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and another master's degree in international economics and international development from Johns Hopkins University, and too many other accolades to mention. Welcome to the bridge.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction and for the invitation, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. I'm a huge fan of the program at Johns Hopkins. A lot of the people that I follow and a lot of the research I follow comes out of that university. So it's so nice to have, one of their great thinkers with us today.
They do a lot of China-Africa work too, which is very interesting.
Yeah. So African leaders are set to arrive here where I am in Beijing in September in 2024 for the summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It looks like it's FOCAC. When you read it, sometimes it's just FOCAC. What will African leaders be looking for from their Chinese counterparts?
So I think more so than African leaders, us Africans are going to watch and anticipate what the outcomes are of the former China-Africa Cooperation Summit. I think there's no doubt that our leaders who are going there with the expectation to be able to attract more Chinese investment, particularly in infrastructure. I think the increasing partnership between China and Africa is growing. I think there's a feeling that this is a very level partnership, that the terms are seemingly more favorable. I think that's obviously arguable. But I think what's actually very interesting to note is that at the exact same time the forum is taking place in Beijing, the African Union is hosting its inaugural African Urban Forum in Addis Ababa. And so I don't think this juxtaposition was done by design, but I think it's really important in terms of how we think about the outcomes of the Forum China-Africa Cooperation Summit, because really that infrastructure investment needs to go into Africa's cities to make Africa's cities much more livable, productive, and sustainable. To be able to unleash economic growth for the continent. So I think, whilst I will actually be in Addis Ababa at the time at the African Urban Forum, myself and others will be very much looking out for the communique coming from the summit.
I was talking, I'm sorry, I didn't put all the questions that I wanted to ask. I met with a colleague earlier today who is also an African, and he was telling me that he doesn't think that China is he doesn't think it's probable that the outcome is going to be loads and loads, hundreds of billions of dollars. He thinks that China may not be in a position to provide the same financial assistance that it was 5 or 10 years ago, and that maybe China will be looking for trade and technical cooperation. What do you think?
So I think that's definitely the case. I mean, obviously, one side is the sort of economic context globally, but also in China has changed since a couple of years ago. But another thing is, and this was going to be something I mentioned later, but I think it's very relevant now, China effectively is one of the new lenders on the block to Africa, right? And so a lot of this is a learning process as well, not just for African leaders receiving Chinese loans, but also for China who is providing the loans, right? And I think there is now much more understanding that things like looking at the debt sustainability, understanding how the debt is going to be repaid, understanding where the investments are going, ensuring that these are productive investments that generate revenues, that can repay the loans, are much stronger considerations now than they were perhaps previously. So I think, part of it, as your friend probably said, part of it is a function of the economic environment we're in, but part of it, I think, is also just learning. I think the technical cooperation is important. I mean, partially the reason I moved halfway across the world from having lived in East Africa the past sort of 15 or so years to now living in Hong Kong is because, these two urbanization trajectories, I mean, albeit Africa is a continent of 54 very diverse countries, and China is obviously one, albeit very large country, the urbanization trajectories are quite similar. And so it's really interesting to understand how that technical cooperation will look like and what that could unleash in the future.
Could you tell us what China has done in terms of infrastructure development at home in China that may serve as a starting point for some of the projects that maybe Africa wants to get started?
Yeah, I mean, I think China's infrastructure investments and outcomes have been surreal, right? You just have to look at some of the maps of where the high-speed rail was just a couple of, a decade or so ago and where it is now. And in fact, living in Hong Kong, I get to benefit from this because, the infrastructure investments are sort of being conceptualized as the Greater Bay Area, which of course Hong Kong is part of. And so, more and more lines are opening. I think there's now an overnight line to Beijing, for example.
Wow.
And so it is incredibly impressive. But I think most of all, I think what China did, and I think I saw this in a speech, I think that President Xi held, I think, 2017 or something. Forgive me if I'm wrong on the date. But he talks about infrastructure connectivity as the foundation of development. And I think this is really the sort of conceptualization of how China urbanized, right? So it wasn't just focusing on the Beijings and the Shanghais, but it was focusing, and now even increasingly more so as it's looking to develop, other parts, on its smaller cities. That can only be done if those cities are well connected, not only nationally, but regionally and also globally as well. And I think this particular form of investment that allows connectivity to be conceptualized as bringing the hinterlands or the smaller cities to the forefront is incredibly important, especially as some of the fastest growing cities in Africa are actually the cities that are the smaller cities rather than the ones that we sort of think of as the primary cities today.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if this question's coming up later or not, but I wanted to ask, in your opinion, would it be feasible to create, trans-African, high-speed rail or road networks? Is that something that the African Union framework could provide, or some other institution?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, here is where China has obviously the distinct advantage of being one country and therefore operating under one framework. Whereas, as I mentioned, I think it's really, particularly when you're making these comparisons, I mean, it's relatively obvious, but it bears re-emphasizing because sometimes it's forgotten because Africa's talked to us as a country, but Africa's really diverse with a lot of different sort of historical, institutional, political, and economic structures, right? So when you're talking about transcontinental infrastructure development, the hard infrastructure is probably the stuff that's the easiest. We're talking now about the soft infrastructure, about how you make that work within the sort of diversity of institutional structures you're there. However, there is a big advantage, which is in January 2021, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement was operationalized, right? And this is the agreement under which all African countries have now declared the move towards a free trade area across the continent. Why this is relevant is because outside the World Trade Organization, this is actually now the largest free trade area in terms of number of countries, geographic, population, right? And, if it works, there's various different models out there, but some predict that it could raise 30 million people out of poverty, boost output by 450 billion, et cetera, by 2035. But for all of that to happen, it requires these infrastructure investments, right? And I think one of the ways to think about it is a lot of, and this is where China is also playing a big role, right? A lot of the African continent is not at the coast, right? So a lot of the landlocked countries are dependent on the ports, are dependent on the airports, are dependent on other ways to connect them to the globe. Most African trade, however, is done by roads still. And I think I read a statistic recently that of the 2.8 million kilometers of roads that there currently are, which is still not sufficient, but even of those, only 800,000 kilometers are paved, right? So this is really like when you think about the immensity of the work that needs to be done. This is critical because right now 80 to 90% of African trade still takes place by road, right? So I think both in terms of upgrading that network, but also thinking of ways that it's more efficient to trade, particularly rail, I think is very critical. And as I said, I think China definitely has the hard infrastructure down. There's no doubt the speed that they built their own infrastructure in their country. I think now it's about navigating the soft infrastructure, and hopefully the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can support this.
Wow. You've worked with the African Development Bank. I'm curious to learn more about this institution and your assessment. Are there sufficient funds for financing projects in Africa?
So I think this is a very interesting question. Because, often a time, which is true, like very large numbers are thrown around about this sort of infrastructure deficit that exists on the African continent. I mean, I've just talked about the road paving situation, right? But if you look at it cumulatively, I think the most recent estimates by the African Development Bank are that somewhere there's a deficit of 130 to 170 billion US dollars annually, of which 100 billion are not filled. So essentially we're building on the deficit as we go forward. And then on top of that, you got to imagine that all of this infrastructure now needs to be climate proofed, right? We need to build in mitigation and adaptation. So that makes it at the outset more expensive. Obviously, it saves you costs down the way, but when you're talking about the actual investment. So essentially these numbers are huge. Now, there is not enough finance flowing. That is clear. I mean, I think one of the statistics that I look at a lot is climate finance, because this is a sort of the new finance on the block, so to speak. There's a lot of climate finance, a lot of finance looking for climate projects. And I think, again, I'm sorry, I apologize, I'm an economist, I like data, but sometimes it can illustrate the point quite well. Of the, I think, 680 billion climate finance that there was in 2020, only about 3% flowed to the African continent, of that 3%, 40% was to 5 of the 54 countries, right? So the money is not coming. That being said, that's the supply side. I think it's always really, really important to note that there would be more money coming if the demand side was better. And what do I mean by the demand side? Well, it's how you translate those humongous numbers that I've just mentioned into actual projects that can be invested in. And there we have a critical shortage of capacity too, in terms of preparing projects. I think there would be a much stronger flow of finance from China and elsewhere if there was the projects, if we could move from the sort of idea stage or from this big number, what the infrastructure deficit is, to actually concretely where we want investments. And that requires long-term visioning, it requires project preparation, and it requires the sort of, as I said, the soft infrastructure. So that's what I'm talking about, the regulatory and the policy environment to which that money can then be sort of apportioned over a longer period of time. And I think so we're both facing this supply side problem, but also a demand side problem in terms of getting the money to where it's needed.
That's fascinating. So you've identified a bottleneck as basically project planning that needs to be rectified. More people need to be working in that field in order to facilitate getting these projects financed. That's really interesting. I'm going to have to be looking out for that in the future. I hope that you can provide some papers or, a guidance for people in the future, because that's certainly, if you found and identified that as a major bottleneck, then there's so much. It does seem like there is a lot of financing available, and a lot of it's not actually getting deployed. So maybe that if people like yourself could facilitate an opening up that bottleneck, we could really see some change that would happen faster. I wanted to ask you about the IMF and World Bank. It looked like, if I was reading your CV earlier today correctly, you had some experience at the World Bank. Now, I wanted to know, how would you characterize the IMF and World Bank as lenders to Africa?
So just a caveat, I've had very little experience directly with the World Bank. I've done some research in a short-term paper for them, but I've never actually been employed or associated with the World Bank or the IMF directly. But I've within the work that I do within the urban space, particularly the World Bank is a major player, and so I think that's where my interactions come from. Look, I think major player probably underpins the importance of these institutions still today. But although they're both Bretton Woods institutions, they're both very different in terms of the type of lending they do, right? So whilst the World Bank focuses on these longer term concessional loans that are really supposed to be there for economic growth and development and poverty eradication. And so it's probably sort of like also investing in the infrastructure side of things, but also sort of public services, as well as it has a technical assistant arm and does knowledge development, which is the part I was doing some research work for them. That's very different than what the IMF does, which is the IMF has a much more shorter term focus on helping countries stabilize their macroeconomic situations, which is also important in the context, for example, now of the conversation we're having on China and Africa in terms of lending, because the IMF also plays a big role when it comes to debt sustainability or unsustainability, depending on how one sees it. Now, one of the things to mention about the IMF and the World Bank, both institutions within the African context, is that they still carry a lot of baggage from particularly the 1980s and 1990s, when they were very much associated with these sort of one-size-fits-all structural adjustment programs, right? These were programs that really promoted sort of public sector retrenchment. They promoted very quick liberalization of economies, and had obviously huge economic and social repercussions, some of which are actually still being felt today. And whilst obviously that's not what they do anymore, it is where the stigma lies within these institutional structures. And we saw that most recently in Kenya with the recent protests in Kenya. We saw that a lot of the blame on the the fiscal austerity measures being proposed by the new tax bill being proposed by the Kenyan government. A lot of blame was being put on the Kenyan government, but also on the IMF, right? And so I think it's important that whilst they play an important role, they also come with a certain institutional image that comes from various historical factors as well.
I wanted to ask you about your thoughts, not just on the Belt and Road Initiative, but on China aid generally. China has engaged in projects all over the African continent. I wanted to know specifically which kinds of projects too, have been successful and why.
Yeah, so my thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it's a really, really fascinating initiative. As I said before, the sort of underpinning of, infrastructure and connectivity being sort of the way that the initiative is conceived, I think is excellent, particularly in the type of world we live in today, which is increasingly globalized, right? The other thing is that it has led to financing of infrastructure projects. Now, the projects where I've seen this I think where it works best is where the projects are part of a larger vision or a larger group of projects, rather than being sort of standalone and individual investments, right? Where I think they run more the risk of being white elephants. And I think more and more China is also realizing this, right? It's not in their interest to finance white elephants because white elephants don't generate the amount of revenues that you need to be able to repay a loan. And so I think where projects can be part of a both bigger sort of, when I'm talking about city vision, when you talk about national vision, or when you talk about region or continental vision, I think they are more successful. I think on the continental side, obviously, I think there's still some learning that needs to be done about how you work across multiple governance structures. I think, as I said, it was slightly easier in China because you're working with one overarching governance structure. So, for example, there was a rail project that was supposed to connect East Africa. And that was how it was conceived, and how it was conceived was really useful because it would have opened up it would have opened up the port further to be able to service the landlocked East African countries. But unfortunately, that the project has stalled a little bit due to it's finished in one country, but it's stalled in the other countries, right? And so I think it's about how you navigate now the cross sort of border institutional structures. But I think more and more I see China sort of learning in that way, and so I think that really, which is that thought of which is underpinning the Belt and Road Initiative, is important. The other thing that will be interesting to see, and this goes back to our first discussion around the forum, is like what type of how China is going to shape its technical assistance moving forward. We talked about project preparation. This is an area that sort of what I want to call the more traditional donors. I don't know how to group other donors, but let's say the more traditional donors, there's more of a realization and they're going into it now. One of the things that I want to learn whilst I'm here at this side of the world is honestly how project preparation has taken place in the context of such fast infrastructure development. And it'd be interesting to see whether the Chinese, through their China aid or other sort of technical assistance work, also start getting more involved in this. They may be, but I haven't seen them as prominently as some of the other donors in this area.
That sounds like you have your work cut out for you in terms of connecting with all of those people, because it doesn't seem like there's just one team. It's like multiple teams all doing. I try to get into this too, like how did poverty alleviation work in China? And I interview one person after another, and it's always just one tiny piece of a giant puzzle.
Yeah.
In terms of you mentioned facilitating better outcomes so debts can be repaid and things like that. China erased a lot of debt. If you, I get this from Johns Hopkins website, the SAIS website. They have a lot of the debt forgiveness, and obviously, no one wants that to happen. Countries should be able to pay back their loans because they created the wealth, that the prosperity around that, enough to be able to do so. So and I think a lot of people in China and a lot of the African leaders who are coming to Beijing are going to be asking the same question. So what is it that China and Africa need to do when they're planning these projects to facilitate better outcomes?
I think you already sort of mentioned the pretty much the operative word is plan, right? I think what and here I hold our own leaders, including my own in Uganda, accountable for this, right? This is not just we have a lot of agency in this. I think often in time it's thought about China, comes in and offers all of these loans, and African leaders have no agency. I think by no means is that the geopolitical context. I think there is a lot of agency, and we should ascribe a lot of accountability in the agency to our own leaders. But therefore, I think there needs to be a lot more forward planning and a lot more thinking about where is which investment going to make more sense, particularly in an environment that is resource scarce, right? Both now, as we mentioned before, the sort of from the Chinese economy perspective, but also African economies are developing countries. There is not like tons of money to go around. So it makes the imperative of investing scarce resources to the most effective way much more important. And I think what we mean by effective here, we talked about productive. Productive is important because, like, obviously that's how it generates economic growth, which ultimately regenerates revenue, which can be used to repay the loan, but also to reinvest in the country. But I think it's also important to not forget the other two pieces. Well, how I think about it is livability, right? How do we create space that actually makes people productive, right? If we're only thinking about the productivity angle, but we're not thinking about how people live so that they are productive and they can be productive members of society, which China did a lot of investment in too, right? China invested a lot not only in its housing, but also in its, for example, in its education, right? So that it could create citizens that could contribute productively to the economy. And the third one, where we, I think, as the African continent, and I always feel bad speaking on behalf of a very, very diverse continent, but given this is the theme, please forgive the sort of generalization that I'm undertaking here. But I think we don't have the liberty to undertake a similar urbanization trajectory as, for example, the US, UK, but nor as China did, right? Which was one that was very much driven by smokestacks, right? Which was very much driven by industries and polluting in environmental concerns that we're now sort of seeing the impacts of, right? So we need to also figure out how these infrastructure investments can be done in such a way that also conserve the sort of scarce resources we have environmentally. So I think, the challenge is cut out, but I think these are the discussions that need to be had, so that we're not just sort of picking and choosing, cherry picking projects here and there, because that's not going to lead to any of those outcomes, but more, where is the collective that we can do? And here I think my own leader is just as accountable in this conversation. And so that's why, looking towards this forum to see what comes out of it.
Well, from the beginning of our interview to now, I've already reshaped my thinking on a couple of these issues. For me, I was thinking we need a rail from Cape Town to Addis Ababa, but it doesn't look like that would actually be useful. Based on your articulation of basically inland countries need access to ports, so it's beneficial for the country holding the port city to help provide access to inland countries, because their port's going to be the one importing and exporting all of these goods. What is holding back these kinds of projects, throughout the continent, of setting up various ports to rail and other infrastructure inland?
So first of all, I'm not saying that a rail from Addis to Cape Town wouldn't be useful. I'm sure it will be, right? There's a lot of things that could be extremely useful, right? It's just where in the hierarchy of needs are we now, right? And how do we prioritize? I think prioritization, that's the word I'm looking for, right? There's a lot of things that could be useful, but where do we start that we can unleash the sort of virtuous cycle of being able to then repay debt and then take on more debt? And then, so sort of that cycle of that then will create more infrastructure investments. Why hasn't the sort of, so I do think, countries like my own Uganda we do rely heavily on the port of Mombasa right now in Kenya. Increasingly there, deals being signed with the ports in Tanzania. So, there are there are facilitation. But I think two things. One is that most of this trade is taking place by road, right? And this is expensive, right? So there's some like shocking statistic that I don't unfortunately have off the top of my head, but what it costs to take a container from China to the port in Beira in Mozambique, and then from Mozambique, the short distance further to Malawi. That short distance is multiples of what the cost is from getting it from China to Beira in the first place, right? And so I think what we need to do is understand how we can improve that connectivity, right? Especially if we want to increase intra-African trade. But then I also think we need to think about not just the intra, but it's also about we live in a globalized environment, right? It's how we extend outwards. And I think this is, again, where China's industrialization story is really how it both in some cases created and in other cases just plugged into global value chains, right? And didn't produce necessarily everything. Nor does one city in China, right, produce everything. I hear this, and I haven't actually been there, nor do I know the name of the city, but I hear there's a city that produces 90% of buttons in the world. And I'm like, that's fascinating, right? But you're not going to make like economic growth of just producing buttons. Those buttons are needed for trousers, those buttons are needed for shirts. So you need to be able to plug into the value chain that requires those buttons. You've specialized in button production, fantastic. But how do you then plug that in? And I think so we need to both look inward, but we also need to look outward. But we also need to prioritize, right? We can't do everything at once. And that prioritization piece, I think, is really important.
Problem. China has eliminated absolute poverty, although poverty still exists in China. Are there tools that China has used that could help Africans eliminate the absolute poverty? We're talking about the most extreme poverty.
Yeah. I mean, this is what fascinates me about China and this part of the world, right? I mean, they managed to lift, I think, over 800 million people in just one generation out of poverty through their urbanization process. And you're right. Like, I think we also have to like what's behind the statistics, right? There is still poverty, but this is sort of meeting the basic needs, and that's really impressive. I think. I mean, part of this is the sort of learning that I'm doing. Part of what I'm doing right now, which I should have probably mentioned earlier, is that I'm on a learning journey. I moved here about a year ago, partially because I wanted to get new ideas, partially because I want to understand the Chinese urbanization process in more depth, particularly the sort of operational aspects that we've been discussing. And like a lot of this, I think this is also how you found me, is part of a blog series that I have now on the Conversation Africa. So, part of my journey and my learning is still happening. But I do think one of the things that I have learned and that I really sort of ascribe to is that we think of China as a sort of monolith, right? Sort of one country. Even albeit a big country, we sort of think it was one country. But actually, I think what is most fascinating when you look at the past decades where China has undergone its urban transition is that rather than sort of ascribing one policy fits all, the central government, in fact, empowered local governments to be able to experiment and to locally figure out what is in their interest to do and how it is in their interest to do it. And not only encourage them, it actually incentivized them. So it closely monitored them. It provided performance bonuses on, outcomes and things like that. I think this ability to innovate at a local level is what is actually needed. I don't think we're ever going to, I don't believe in silver bullet solutions. I don't believe in, copy paste and one size fits all. I actually think you need to be able to meet local conditions and context and use that to then sort of be able to improve your economic performance. But the thing that this needs to come with, and this is kind of my area of research, right? It needs to come with the fiscal tools to do it as well, right? You can't just say, go forth and innovate and experiment. You also need the ability to raise the money to do that. And I think that combination of both incentivizing and encouraging local experimentation, but also empowering local governments to be able to have the fiscal tools, in the case of China, particularly through the land lease system, to be able to do that. I think that was, to me, one of the key aspects and learnings that we can think about adopting, particularly in a diverse continent, a diverse context as the African continent. But even more diverse, within the continent, within the countries, we have multiple thousands of cities. So, that localization and experimentation and incentivization to do that, I think, is really important.
People keep bringing up the financial aspect of funding the projects that need to be built in the developing world. And we have the AIIB, we have the BRI, we have MOFCOM and different banks in China. We also have World Bank and IMF, and we have various private lenders that I know people don't want to go to because the interest rates are astronomical. You also have the African Development Bank. Are the I mean, Mike, because I'm an outsider to this, and you've worked inside some of these organizations. Are these organizations talking to each other, working with each other to facilitate the best kind of outcomes, and how does that process work?
I think increasingly more so, definitely. I think more could be done. And I also think, increasingly I'm starting to see China as part of these conversations. I think it used to be much more of a sort of outsider to many of these conversations, but I'm seeing, particularly in the countries that I know and that I work in. I mean, obviously I can't speak for all, but I see this conversation being opened up, not only to China, but there's also other sort of new types of lenders. For example, the UAE, Turkey, I think to name two, who are also making large infrastructure investments. But I think much more needs to be done and can be done. And in particular, what the complementarities are in terms of what everyone is doing, right? So in some senses, you don't need to, as one lender, do everything. If someone has already started something, you can maybe supplement and be able to, or complement that, right? Okay, if you're building road A, how about I take road B, which connects to road A, to be able to do that? I think that is probably the part which I still see very much lacking, is like, how do we, I think the opening up of speaking to each other, I think is there. The actual sort of act of coordinating, I think there's a lot that could still be done. I think the other thing is, back to the question about where, is there enough finance? I think a lot of these institutions are actually looking for places to invest their money. I mean, they're banks at the end of the day, many of the ones that you listed, and they want to invest, right? And they're looking for projects. So I think, cooperation around the project preparation side is also critical in this, right? Where are all these projects that everyone wants to invest in, and how are we going to do that? And then finally, I think there needs to be much more coordination with the host country government as well, right? I think one of the things that is challenging, at least again from where I've worked and where I sat, which is obviously not which is only a handful of countries, and in particular city governments, right, is the amount of time it takes to interact with everyone, right? And there's only so many hours in a day and only so many people, right? And so I think if particularly with city governments, particularly smaller ones that have lower capacity in terms of just sheer number of people working there, right? I think we also have to be cognizant of how we streamline work and reporting and other things like that, just take time out of people's day, because effectively, I mean, I work as an urban economist, so I focus at the city level. Effectively, cities are there to deliver to people. And obviously, I'm all about the accountability and the report writing, but there's a lot that can be done to make that sort of a much more streamlined process, rather than writing a report to every single individual funder.
I think I personally would like some good news. So I kind of built this question so I could get some good news, because the last 5 years have been very difficult for the global economy. Your focus is urbanization. What are some good examples of how African cities have urbanized, and why were these examples successful?
Yeah, I'm glad you put in this question. I'm often asked about the challenges, and I actually want to speak about the opportunities, because I think the opportunity is huge, and I think that's what China demonstrates, right? Through a well-managed urbanization process, in one generation, you're able to lift over 800 million people, out of poverty. That's what stands there. And like Africa, I think there are statistics that like 2/3 of African cities are yet to be built, right? So we have this opportunity to manage urbanization trajectory that could lead to similar outcomes, but the time frame is short, right? So the expectation is about these 2/3 of cities still to be built or to grow is going to happen between now and 2050. So the time frame is even shorter and even closer than what China experienced. That being said, I think there are some cities that have really embraced and understood this, and that are forward planning, right? And I think forward planning, and I think you mentioned it before, what's key here is the planning piece. There's a handful of secondary cities in Ethiopia, in Uganda, and in Somaliland that have done that are planning for their urban expansion. I mean, one major opportunity that Africa has is that it's urbanizing an incredibly data-rich environment, which many countries that and continents that urbanized before were not able to do, right? And so you know where people are moving, you know where cities are going to come, you know where cities are going to grow, so you can plan for that, right? And so what they've done is in the areas where they know the city will expand to, they've essentially just done a grid roadmap. And where does that grid idea come from? Well, you just have to look at New York City or Barcelona, like they're all planned on grids, right? It's an ancient old idea. But the point is, if you don't have the money now, just at least keep the space for your roads and your utility works that you're going to need to manage your city so that you can put it in afterwards. And why do that? Because the cost of retrofitting, both, the financial, the social, and the political cost is huge. And that's what we're experiencing in some cities like Kampala, Nairobi, Lagos, for example, right? So when people settle, it's difficult to move people and then try and do this retroactively. And so through securing this sort of grid system and sort of indicating to people and businesses that you are intending to build there and you're intending to invest in infrastructure, you can actually undertake a process of orderly urban expansion and ordinary settlement. And just to, again, pepper this with data, as you've now come to expect from me, in Ethiopia, the cities of sort of Adama, Bahir Dar, Hawassa, and Mekelle, they managed to sort of, first of all, keep about 6%. I mean, it's not that much, right? It's only 6% of the land mass on average per city open. And then subsequently raise the money to build 570 kilometers of new roads, housing for 140,000 households, and sort of create 26,000 jobs, right? And so I think this forward planning, this understanding of how we also manage these 2/3 of city to come, even if we don't have the money to invest in infrastructure now, at least plan where it's going to be and keep that space open, I think is really key. And with sort of strong and good leadership, this is what can be done.
I kind of want to ask another question that's similar to this, because I come from the United States, where we built most of our infrastructure a century ago. So we have all of these outdated trains. The world watches our train crashes. They're pretty regular at this point. Yeah, I'm sorry to say. I mean, that doesn't just happen in the United States, just to be a little defensive there. But I mean, one of the things I saw here in Beijing was I went to the countryside one time and there was a subway stall in the middle of cornfields. And I was like, what is going on? Why is this here? It was connected and everything. And then I came back a couple of years later and there was like a new urban environment built around that area. And so one of the advantages China has had is that it came later to developing. And so it was able to do all of the things that the United States wish that it could do. Because California, we're trying to build high-speed rail from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Very difficult because there are so many developed projects already on those lines. So my question for you is, now that United States is developed and China is getting close to being completely developed, do you think Africa has the opportunity to do it better than everyone and bring it to a whole new level?
So optimistic me says yes, absolutely, right? We also have the opportunity to learn, both to sort of leapfrog certain innovations and investments, but also to avoid, right? But that does require learning and leadership. I would also say, partially, and I'm not a US expert whatsoever, so I'm forgive me if this is sort of totally out of place, but partially it's also, the US, some of the strongest planning, as I was talking about the New York 1811 plan, right? I mean, if you look at Manhattan today, that is pretty much one for one the plan that was created in 1811. That's pretty incredible, right? But there's also a cultural factor, right? When you talk about rail and other sort of public transport infrastructure that I've got, the few times I've visited the US and when I studied there, it's the car is preferred, right? The car is the sort of being, and so cities are built for cars rather than for moving people. Right? It's about sort of moving cars, and so there, it's not only just the infrastructure shift; it's the cultural shift that comes with then sort of shifting a population who's very much based on understanding their sort of individual motorized arrangements to high speed rail and things like that. I think China, on the other hand, with, obviously with exceptions, and I know that it faces a high congestion in some cities, but the high-speed rail was so much part of its culture of moving people, right? Especially across distances, that and on top of it, the investments that were made to make public transport comfortable, right? When I think about here in Hong Kong, one of my favorite pieces about Hong Kong is the public transport system, the MTR system. It's like, it's absolutely incredible, right? It's efficient, it's quick, it's comfortable because it's air conditioned, particularly like right now when it's extremely humid here in Hong Kong. You can get everywhere with it, and you can time yourself to the last minute, right? And so I think, a measure of its success is that, the majority of trips are taken by public transport here, whereas that's not the case in the US. So I think, Africa, again, has a very short window to get it right, but we want to, and in a lot of cities, including my own Kampala, there is no mass public transport system. I really think we need to get on that very, very quickly. Otherwise, we'll have created a similar culture where it's difficult to then shift people away from cars. And we just don't, I mentioned the road capacity before, right? We can already physically, if you've ever gone to any African capital city, you'll sit in a lot of traffic for a very long period of time because the road capacity is absolutely full and cars are just increasing by the day, right? So that window, we need to take that window of opportunity and sort of create the culture and the incentives to develop differently, because otherwise we will face not only the financial cost of retrofitting that you mentioned, but also that social political cost of trying to move people to a different form of being, which I think is very difficult to do in any circumstance.
My next question is about renewable energy, because China is rolling it out so fast that, some countries are even accusing China of overcapacity. In the past, China, and along with other investors from, Italy, France, and the United States, have been helping develop hydropower and conventional fossil fuels in Africa, because obviously, you can't have modernity without electrification. So that is a requisite, thing that we need to move forward on. Is renewable energy an important tool for creating industrialization and modernity in Africa?
Absolutely. I think I could probably just end there and say, like, absolutely.
Yes.
I think, you mentioned it. It's a key input. Partially one of the reasons that Africa is struggling to attract firms and businesses is that we just do not have a reliable electricity supply, right? My daughter, when we moved here to Hong Kong, was like, "Wow, Mummy, the power doesn't go out when it rains." And I'm like, "Yeah," because in Uganda, in Kampala, by the time we left, right, often the time, it'd start raining, we'd be like, "Please let the power stay on, please let the power stay on." And okay, we're just one household, right? But if you are a firm that's trying to do business, like all major firms rely on power as an input, right? So it's critical in terms of that productivity piece that we're talking about, but it's also critical in terms of sustainability. And here, I think this is where, I'm looking to the outcomes of the forum, but I'm really hoping. It's interesting you say overcapacity, or there's criticisms of overcapacity, because I feel like it may be there, but there's so much demand for capacity elsewhere, right? And so it's a bit about how you allocate the capacity. And I think, in Africa, that would be fantastic. I think the other thing to learn from China is, like, part of the reason they've got here is, like, incredible investments in research and innovation. And being able to incentivize that type of research and innovation into these sectors. And I think, when there was an Economist article a couple of weeks ago, which just demonstrated how much at the forefront of the renewable industry, of other industries too, but especially the renewable industry, China is, right? So I think, given the demand that is the latent demand that is there in the African context, I think, this should be a clear area for partnership, and I hope to see it happen.
I'm concerned because you mentioned power going out, because solar and wind are, also based on the environment. Is it sunny? Is it windy? Hopefully there'll be all the battery, and residual facilities that will help maintain electricity. May I just ask really quickly, what do you think about nuclear?
Oh, to be honest, this is something where I don't personally have enough information to form
I see. Sure, no
an
problem.
informed opinion on it. So I don't want to speak to it, but I just wanted to point out on the battery power. I was always told, I'm not an energy expert, but I was always told this is a sort of the missing frontier is this battery power piece. But I was also told recently by some colleagues and friends here that, China is really on the cusp of like also figuring out the battery piece and the storage piece. And I think if we can figure that piece out, then, we have it. The other thing is we talk about Africa's natural resources in a way that we always think about the sort of the fossil and the mineral and the commodity resources. But in a lot of African countries, its weather is a massive resource, right? Both its sun, but also in terms of agricultural production. I mean, that's why we have commodity resources. So how do we harness that? We talked about hydropower, for example. There's some of the biggest river in the world flows through Africa, the Nile, right? And so I think we need to think about this broader, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I mean, I'm a huge fan of hydropower, and there's an enormous amount of it now in Africa where there wasn't as much maybe 20 years ago. Europe and the US developed a century ago. China is arriving. What unique problems and opportunities exist as Africa is developing now?
So I think these are fourfold. So one is this, as I mentioned, or I keep mentioning, is the speed, right? No place in the world, not even China, has urbanized as quickly as Africa is. So there's going to be nearly 1 billion more people being born or moving to African cities in the next 25 years, right? That's a huge amount of people for any place to accommodate, right? But especially one that needs to make such large investments in infrastructure for livability, productivity, and sustainability. So the speed is a critical one. The second one, and this is the interesting one because this is the one where I face a lot of strong discussion points when I get into discussions here in Hong Kong, but also have done in China before, which is that Africa is urbanizing without industrializing. And in China, this is kind of unheard of because they all say this is like two sides of the same coin. Urbanization and industrialization happen together. And in Africa, it's not. And there's multiple theories and reasons why that's the case. But I think one of the unique challenges will be for all these like people who are already living there and the 1 billion more, or nearly 1 billion more to come. How do we create jobs, right? You can't have people living in cities and not having jobs. And industrialization was the key to that in China. And industrialization, perhaps in a different form, will need to be key to that in Africa. So we need to figure that piece out. I think a challenge / opportunity that both China, and which is why I think learning from China is important, is that, both the African continent and China as a country urbanized in a very globalized world, right? It no longer has to do with what you can do just within your country or just within your region. It has to do with what, the world is your marketplace, but also the world is your competitor, right? So you need to think beyond that. So that's the third reason. And the fourth reason I kind of mentioned when I was talking about the planning aspect, a major opportunity is that we're urbanizing in a time where we've never had this much information. And so it's the question about how we harness that information and make evidence-based decisions based on it that can benefit not only the current, but also the future populations.
Well, I'm glad that you're offering advice to various areas throughout Africa because it sounds like you have some very good advice. You're currently, this show, we like to talk about people's experience when they come to China. You live in Hong Kong. How do you find it?
I actually really love it. It took some while getting used to it. It's a highly efficient place. As I said, now that I can plan my trips to the minute, everything is planned very much to the minute. But I think it's been, and it continues to be, an absolutely fascinating learning experience. I mean, Hong Kong is the density that many African cities are or will have surpassed shortly, right? But yet it's very well managed density. I think that's the key that I'm trying to figure out is how do you, this density is going to happen, that's a given, but how do you manage it in a way that you can get people to have a livable environment in this density? I think one of my, I talked about the MTR being one of my favorite things, and I'm sure a lot of people who come here are just like, mind blown by the public. And it's not just the MTR, it's the fact that the MTR is connected to an incredible bus system, is connected to a ferry system. All of it is highly affordable, of high quality, and very much on time. I think the thing that fascinated me more, though, coming here is that the amount of public space. So when there's so much density and land is so valuable, I think you often assume that the first thing to go is public space. But public space is so key, particularly in a place like Hong Kong where there's so much density, is so key to livability. And I think for me, what has been absolutely fascinating is to see how the public space is treated essentially as sacrosanct, right? So you'll be in a very large, very dense part of the city, but you'll have a beautiful park. the waterfront you'll always make sure that the waterfront is accessible to all and has, for example, shaded areas so that you can actually use the waterfront even when it's a hot day like today. So I'm learning a lot and particularly fascinated as well by public space and its importance in the city. So this is all part of my learning journey right now, but I'm definitely very much enjoying it.
May I ask where have you been in China's mainland?
So not as far as I've wanted to go, primarily to Beijing and surrounding areas. But I have the major benefit, thanks to the Chinese government, that has just waived visa requirements for certain countries, including Austria, that now I'm able to travel to China much more efficiently, especially now that I can take, for example, the metro to Shenzhen. And so I look forward to now, given these new visa regulations, to be able to see much more. And I hope, as I said, part of my learning journey, like in the past year, has been very much focused on Hong Kong, and now I want to expand to mainland China. And I hope to be able to establish some of the connections that will allow me to do that and allow me to understand much more from a policy and operational perspective how this impressive urban transition happened.
Well, it's incredible listening to you. You're so articulate. But, Beijing and Hong Kong are both really old cities. What I find fascinating is, in terms of two-thirds of the cities in Africa haven't been built yet, is maybe Shenzhen is a really good model, because Shenzhen was a fishing village, 30, 40 years ago, and now it's one of the largest metropolitan cities in the world. So in terms of like coming out of nothing and then building something incredible, what are your opinions? You've gone through Shenzhen. What do you think of it?
So I haven't been to Shenzhen. It is coming in the next week.
Wow.
But I am very excited to go to Shenzhen for two reasons. One, for the first reason that you mentioned, but secondly, because the Shenzhen model is wanting to be copy and pasted in a lot of places in Africa. And as I said, I'm not a big fan of the copy and paste. I'm a big fan of trying to unpack the learning experience and understand what's happened. So the reason I hadn't gone to Shenzhen yet is because I've been doing a lot of research and reading around Shenzhen first, because I want to be able to approach it in a way that obviously allows me to be astounded by what has happened, but also be able to see that and how that's been overcome. So that's why, if you'd asked me the first place I would want to go, it would obviously be Shenzhen, because again, so many places like, we want to be the next Shenzhen, we want to be next Shenzhen. And from what I understand, even in China, that was the case, right? And Shenzhen is even particularly unique within the Chinese context. But I have so much respect for this place that I didn't want to go as the sort of tourist who's like, wow, I wanted to try and see what I could find out about it first and be able to approach it that way. So it's coming. So watch this space, particularly my blog, because there will definitely be a blog dedicated to Shenzhen. And the best thing is I can take the MTR there.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, because you're in all connected now. All of the cities down south are really well. They're trying to do that here around Beijing and Hebei, try to create a similar zone as they succeeded at creating in the Pearl River Delta area down there, but it hasn't worked out quite to the degree that it is where you are. I was just thinking, you're Austrian, you're Ugandan, you've lived in the United States at Johns Hopkins, you've also been to London, you live in Hong Kong, and you're now traveling in China. Is there anywhere, are there any continents you haven't been to?
Actually, Antarctica is the only one right now, because I actually went to Australia, so that was Australasia wasn't something I hadn't been there yet. But so this is I think the 10th country and the 4th continent I've lived on. So I've lived and worked in a bunch of different places. But the reason I do that is because I think if we want to understand the world and if we want to understand what the learnings are, you have to immerse yourself, right? I had this incredible opportunity because Hong Kong opened up this top talent visa scheme, which is the visa scheme I'm on, which allows you to live and work here for if you fulfill certain conditions of their sort of top talent roster, you're allowed to live and work here for 2 years. So I jumped on the opportunity because I'm like, when, I read so many of these case studies, you can travel back and forth. That's, it's true. There's like direct flights from Addis to Hong Kong or to Beijing or to Guangzhou every day, right? But that's not the same as living here, breathing here, getting to meet people, being able to like understand what it is. And, the plan is always that the plan is to go back and live in Uganda or elsewhere in Africa. But it's very refreshing to be able to get new ideas, new ways of thinking, to be able to understand. And I think what's been really, really cool here is that so many people are also interested in the African urbanization story. And so I feel like, I'm hoping that even now, over my second year here, I'm just starting my second year, that I'm able to fulfill some very unique gap, which is not only sort of learning, doing the sort of one-way learning, but doing two-way learning, right? What can sort of trying to learn from Africa too, because I think there are certain things that are really important in the way that we've done, for example, very localized planning, very innovative planning, for example, at neighborhood scale, that now is also relevant to, or has always been relevant to places in China as well. So I'm hoping to build that out a little bit more, but it's very, very cool to see how people are interested in hearing about the African urbanization story too.
Wow, I've learned so much in this short hour. I really feel amazed that I have this job, that I get to interview people like you. I hope that we can get you on next year.
Yeah, I have totally different learning, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
You too. Thanks for the invite and really very fascinating conversation.